42-year-old Ghazal Mansury lived at home with her elderly mother.
She helped her mom with bills or the upkeep of the home.
A lot of times I would see them out doing something in the garden.
But then, at the age of 79, Ghazal's mother disappeared.
When an elderly person goes missing, one thinks, well, maybe they've forgotten where they are.
Ghazal said her mom was suffering from Alzheimer's.
Go inside the search as family and friends frantically tried to find the missing woman.
We had neighbors and volunteers looking all over.
But was there an entirely innocent explanation for her disappearance?
Maybe she fell down and got injured.
Or will the shocking truth threaten to tear this tight-knit immigrant family apart?
We believe that her daughter did something to her.
September 25, 2013, San Diego, California. That Wednesday evening, the San Diego police received a worried call from the family of 79-year-old Maria Mansury.
Maria is part of a very large, well-connected, close Afghan family, most of whom live in San Diego or in Los Angeles.
This extended family really took care of each other. They watched out for each other.
Would telephone each other on a regular basis.
And that was especially true of Maria.
Everybody's in contact with my aunt on a daily basis.
The extended family looked up to her. She was seen as the matriarch.
But the day before, the family matriarch had gone suddenly, disturbingly silent.
Maria was not picking up either the cell phone or the landline.
The family had tried to contact Maria off and on all day.
It was so unlike Maria to be gone, to be inaccessible by phone.
They'd also tried to reach her in person.
A family member goes to the house, she wasn't there.
But it wasn't until that Wednesday afternoon that the family had finally been able to get in touch with someone at the house. Maria's 42-year-old daughter, Ghazal Mansury.
She was the only child.
Although Ghazal lived with her mother, she had been out most of the day before, volunteering at a local church. And what she told the rest of the family that Wednesday afternoon was enough to turn their concern into panic.
She said she last saw her mother on Tuesday morning.
And that left the investigators with two questions. Where had the missing matriarch been for more than 24 hours? And why hadn't her daughter done anything to find her? Born in 1971, Ghazal was just days old when her birth parents abandoned her at an orphanage, which is where Maria found her. Unlike the grim circumstances of Ghazal's birth, Maria had been born into one of Afghanistan's most prominent families.
She was brought up in a highly educated, well-to-do family.
She had married well, too.
Her husband was a minister in the government.
They had to travel a lot.
And when they were at home in Kabul, the couple had the best of everything.
They had servants, they had cook, chauffeur, the whole 9 yards.
But for all the couple's power, prestige, and privilege, there had always been one thing missing from their otherwise perfect life.
They couldn't conceive children.
And in 1971, that brought Maria to the orphanage where she found Ghazal.
My aunt decided that she wanted to adopt a child.
Ghazal was 3 months old when Maria brought her home.
I'll never forget that day. It was a blessed day. It was a happy day. She was carrying the most beautiful, cheerful, happy baby girl that one could hope for.
And soon, the growing little girl had everything a child could hope for, too.
She was a very pampered baby. She had her food just the way she wanted, her toys.
But most of all, she had a doting mother.
Even though Ghazal had the nanny, it was my aunt who did everything for Ghazal, everything. Ghazal was literally the apple of my aunt's eye.
Ghazal's privileged life in Afghanistan wouldn't last, though. In 1979, when Ghazal was only 8, the Russians invaded and the war changed everything.
They had to flee from Afghanistan.
The family eventually settled in San Diego and started building a new life. But it was a serious step down for a diplomat's wife used to having a house full of servants.
She worked at a department store.
Not that Maria seemed to mind.
She was a hardworking person.
And even with a full-time job and no servants, Maria managed to make the family's house in the American suburbs into their dream home.
When they first moved in, she immediately started cleaning up the yard and fixing it up.
My aunt's house was like a model house.
But while Maria and her husband made the best of things, Ghazal had trouble adjusting to life in America, especially a life without servants.
Ghazal had a hard time of coping with the day-to-day chores, meaning make your bed, meaning brush your hair. She didn't take kindly to any instruction.
And between adjusting to a new culture and learning a new language, she struggled in school, too.
She was not a good student.
The family members believed in her, encouraged her.
Her mother was the most encouraging of all.
The mother believed in Ghazal so much, saw her potential, encouraged her daughter to follow the American dream, to get educated.
But Ghazal wouldn't listen. By high school, it was clear that the only thing the teen had embraced about American life was adolescent rebellion, much to the dismay of her conservative Afghan parents.
She would do and say things that were unbecoming to a girl or a child from a good family.
Especially when it came to boys.
She was extremely extrovert when it came to being flirtatious and chasing the neighbors' boys.
It was typical American teenager behavior, but to Ghazal's immigrant family, her actions were far from normal.
Where I come from, my culture, our upbringing, and our etiquette and decorum, it was a nightmare.
And her parents were certainly appalled.
My uncle and my aunt were embarrassed even to tell me of the things Ghazal had done.
And by the time Ghazal finished high school, the 18-year-old's innocent adolescent rebellion had taken a far more serious turn.
She had been using drugs.
Her drug of choice was methamphetamine.
Afraid that she was losing her daughter, Maria did everything she could to intervene.
She saw her daughter descending into this horrible lifestyle.
Maria and her husband tried to put Ghazal in rehab.
She tried to have a firm hand and lead her.
And when that failed, Maria tried pleading.
Ghazal was coaxed and bribed with a car if she would please attend college.
But nothing worked, and Ghazal's parents were devastated that their bright and beautiful daughter was throwing her life away.
I would see the pain they were going through, the pain of not knowing how to deal with her.
And after her husband died, Maria would be dealing with her daughter alone.
After the passing of my uncle, Ghazal was getting more and more and more involved in drugs, and her choices of friends were becoming worse and worse.
Ghazal spent her 20s and 30s drifting through San Diego's bar scene, dabbling in drugs and bouncing from one boyfriend to the next.
She had never shown signs of employment or bettering herself, just really couldn't get her life together.
Not that Ghazal really needed to, since she always had Maria.
It seemed like every few months, Giselle would be back with Mama.
Ghazal always had her bedroom. She always had her car. She always had her money. I always used to say to my aunt that you are enabling Ghazal.
Maria's answer was always the same.
Mary said, she's my daughter, and I have to take care of her.
There was no doubt that Maria loved her daughter.
But in 2010, with her mother in her 70s and her 40s quickly approaching, it looked as if Ghazal was having a change of heart. She finally started to turn her life around and began trying to make up for all those years of bad behavior by looking after her aging mother.
She came home and helped her mom with the upkeep of the home.
Maria appeared to appreciate having her daughter around.
A lot of times I would see them out painting, or they would be doing something in the garden that Mary wanted to have done.
And Ghazal even got a job of sorts, volunteering at a local church.
She would be part of a team feeding the homeless in the community.
However, their reconciliation would be a short one, because in September of 2013, a little over 2 years after her daughter had finally returned, Maria would disappear. Coming up, is Maria simply lost and confused?
Ghazal said her mom was suffering from Alzheimer's.
Or is there a far more sinister explanation for her disappearance?
Maria's brother noticed that Maria...
On Wednesday evening, September 25th, 2013, San Diego police received a worried call from the family of Maria Mansury. They'd been unable to contact the 79-year-old for more than 24 hours.
They called her numerous times. She wouldn't pick up.
And according to the family, that was highly unusual for Maria, the matriarch of an extended family that had emigrated from Afghanistan in 1979.
They had daily communication.
It was big that Maria wasn't accessible on the phone.
Even more troubling, when Maria's relatives stopped by the house that Wednesday, her daughter, 42-year-old Ghazal Mansury, told them it had been more than 24 hours since she'd last seen her mother on Tuesday morning.
She said she went for a walk.
She walks around the neighborhood. She takes a walk a couple times a day.
Was it possible the 79-year-old had simply gotten lost?
When an elderly person in their late 70s goes missing, one thinks, well, maybe they have dementia, maybe they've forgotten where they are.
That appeared to be the most logical explanation to the police. But Maria's family had a different opinion.
The family said that we believe that her daughter did something to her.
There's no dispute that she was, deeply involved in drugs.
And according to the family, that wasn't all Maria's daughter Ghazal was involved in. According to her relatives, when she was younger, Ghazal had done anything to earn the money to feed her addiction.
She was dancing topless.
A bar that had drugs and had a very bad reputation. She worked there as a dancer.
Maria had been appalled by her daughter's behavior and afraid it would bring shame to the conservative family.
She was a lady of decorum. She didn't want everybody to know.
However, while her family couldn't get Ghazal to stop,
we tried to coax her to come back so we could put her in rehab. She wouldn't come.
Her meth addiction had eventually put an end to her days as a stripper.
Her teeth fell out. Her hair started falling off. Her skin became wrinkly. She looked like 60 when she was only 25.
Although once she was unable to earn money as a stripper, the family said that Ghazal had become even more desperate.
Then Ghazal started stealing.
Even from her mother.
She had in fact stolen some of her mother's jewelry.
She pawned my aunt's diamonds. She would pawn anything that wasn't attached to the ground.
The theft had never been reported.
Maria decided that she did not want Ghazal to be in trouble.
Although according to the family, Ghazal had a way of bringing trouble with her. The family told the police that once Ghazal moved in with her mother, she started bringing her fellow addicts over to the house.
She collected these toothless, dirty, smelly, old guys.
They would sleep in the garage. They would come into the house, use the kitchen.
The family said they'd begged Maria to kick Ghazal out of the house.
I said, cut Ghazal loose.
But Maria had always refused.
She said, no matter how bad she is, I love her.
Instead, Maria had continued to do what she'd always done, urge her wayward daughter to make a change for the better.
Maria would try to persuade her daughter, turn around, look what you've done to yourself, get rid of these friends, improve your life.
The family admitted that at her mother's prompting, Ghazal had made some positive changes.
She was volunteering one day a week at a local church.
But according to the family, that didn't mean mother and daughter got along.
They were always fighting, they were always arguing, they were always yelling.
In an Afghan family like Ghazal's, the mere fact that she yelled at her mother was shocking enough.
Ghazal was very disrespectful to her.
However, according to the family, Ghazal had gone beyond disrespectful.
Ghazal, in front of everybody, called her mother bitch. Just flipped, and she said that you bitch bother me too much.
So many times that it became a comfortable phrase with Ghazal.
Among Afghans, such profound disrespect for one's parents was all but unheard of.
There are boundaries that you should not cross.
Of course, calling her mother a bitch was a long way from killing her. But according to the family, one recent incident suggested that Ghazal's relationship with Maria had gone from disrespectful to violent. It happened on Monday, the day before Maria disappeared.
Maria's brother had visited her and had noticed that Maria had a swollen eye.
When her brother asked what happened, Maria had said it was nothing.
She excused it by saying it was allergies.
But now that Maria had disappeared, her brother and the rest of the family were convinced that it wasn't allergies that caused her eye to swell up.
Ghazal may well have hit her mother.
But did that also mean she had something to do with her mother's disappearance? Once the investigators finished speaking to Maria's family, they drove straight to her house in suburban San Diego to question her daughter.
There was enough red flags that we were alarmed and we were worried.
And there were more red flags when Ghazal came to the door.
Her hair wasn't combed, her clothes were dirty, her fingernails were dirty.
She gave that appearance of someone still struggling with a drug problem.
However, while Ghazal may have looked like an addict, she didn't act like one.
She was cooperative from the beginning. She came willingly to headquarters to provide a statement.
Questioned by the investigators, Ghazal did little to deny much of what the family had already told them.
She made no bones that they didn't have the best of relationships. They would argue over her drug use. They would argue over her bringing people to the home.
But despite their disagreements, Ghazal swore that she would never do anything to hurt her elderly mother.
She would follow up with, "I love my mom. She's all I have."
All she claimed to know was that she'd last seen her mother the previous morning.
Ghazal's statement was, "Well, I went to her room and I got the car keys and I drove the car to my job."
And Ghazal said that by the time she made it home that evening, it had been way past her mother's bedtime.
She always goes to bed no later than 10, so I thought she was in her room.
In fact, Ghazal said she hadn't even realized that her mother was missing until her relatives had knocked on her door on Wednesday morning.
Asked, "Where could your mother be?" She offered up that she's gone for a walk.
And according to Ghazal, if that was the case, it was entirely possible that Maria had wandered off and gotten lost.
Ghazal said her mom was suffering from Alzheimer's.
According to Ghazal, her mother's sharp mind had started to deteriorate in recent months.
She said lately she's become very sick. She has been lost many, many times.
Not only that, Ghazal said her mother had been hiding her illness from the rest of the family, afraid they would put her in a nursing home.
Maria Mansury was a proud woman.
Was it possible that Maria's family had jumped to conclusions, that the investigators' initial hunch was correct?
She could have walked away and got disoriented.
And considering Ghazal's mother was 79 and frail.
Maybe she fell down and got injured and she needs assistance.
Coming up, the search for Maria intensifies.
We had helicopters flying overhead.
And a witness comes forward.
Was really the big break in the case.
By October 2nd, 2013, it had been 8 days since the family of Maria Mansury had reported the 79-year-old missing.
That the family had been calling up, kept calling, and she didn't answer her phone.
And according to Maria's daughter, 42-year-old Ghazal Mansury, she'd last seen her mother 9 days earlier, before Ghazal left for her volunteer shift at a local church.
She said she last saw her mother on Tuesday morning when she took the car keys and she went to work.
And if Ghazal had the car, where was Maria?
Giselle told them that she must have gone for a walk.
Worse, Ghazal had told the investigators that her elderly mother was suffering from the early stages of dementia.
That's a very common search for us. Older people suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's that wander away from their residence or their care facility.
The search for Maria had been extensive.
The search was focused around the residential area where she lived.
They went through the canyons and were searching. We had helicopters flying overhead.
And that was just the official search.
We had maybe 5, 8 different groups, Afghans, family members. My aunt had a lot of friends, neighbors, and volunteers looking all over, people going in the canyons, everywhere that you can imagine.
But as hours turned to days, hope that the missing 79-year-old would be found alive began to fade.
By the end of the week, the whole family was convinced that something terrible had happened.
And the authorities agreed.
It was really all of us coming to the same conclusion that she probably was deceased.
But if Maria was dead, was it simply a tragic case of an elderly person getting disoriented, lost, and dying from exposure? Or was it something more? From the beginning, the family had been dubious of Ghazal's claim that Maria had simply wandered off, doubts that sprang from the complex relationship between mother and daughter.
Everyone that we talked to talked about the disrespect that Ghazal had for her mother.
There's a lot of witnesses that would say they heard arguing and yelling and fighting all the time.
This was a tense relationship.
And according to Maria's family, the tension was mostly due to Ghazal's long history of drug abuse.
She saw her daughter trapped by this insidious culture of methamphetamine addiction. Her life spiraled downhill very quickly.
But did Ghazal's downward spiral have something to do with her mother's disappearance?
We had no proof that there had been any prior physical altercations between mother and daughter.
All they had were suspicions and hunches, until on Wednesday, October 2nd, the police got a call that changed everything. The caller was a man who claimed his ex-wife Trisha knew Ghazal.
Trisha was an acknowledged drug user.
And Trisha's ex claimed that she'd been hanging out with Ghazal on Saturday night.
She had been using drugs. They were in Maria's car.
In the middle of riding around and spending time together, Ghazal discloses that she got into an argument with her mother.
However, according to Trisha's ex, that wasn't all that Ghazal had told her.
Ghazal, out of the blue, tells Trisha, "Oh, by the way, I killed my mother."
She went into the garage and got a bike tire and strangled her mother.
I then put my mother in the trunk of the car and I dumped her body in East County.
According to her ex, Trisha had been shaken by her friend's story.
This impacted Trisha so much that she couldn't get it out of her mind.
And there was no way she could keep it secret either.
Patricia then calls her ex-husband and relays this information to him.
And he was angry with Trisha for even telling him this because he felt that somehow now he was being tainted with this information.
And since Maria's disappearance and the search for her had been all over the news, Trisha's ex had called the police.
He said, "I didn't want to think that this elderly woman's body was being left out there in the elements."
But was his story true?
That information was followed up on by homicide detectives.
And when the homicide detectives brought Trisha in for questioning, she confirmed everything her ex had just told the investigators.
It was really the big break in the case for us.
In fact, Trisha even gave the investigators an alleged motive for Maria's murder. According to what Ghazal had allegedly told Trisha, the family was right. She had been physically abusing Maria. And Trisha said that on the Monday before Maria disappeared, things had gotten out of hand.
Ghazal had caused her to be injured.
Which meant that come Tuesday morning, Ghazal would have a big problem on her hands.
Mary was supposed to have gone to the doctor's office
She couldn't allow her mother in her condition to go to the doctor.
because she was bruised.
The doctor would see it and then report it to the authorities, and that would lead to an investigation, and Ghazal would end up being arrested.
So according to Trisha, Ghazal had come up with a solution.
Ghazal decided, I'm going to kill her.
Trisha's story was a huge break. But before police could charge Ghazal with her mother's murder, they still had to confirm it.
We just needed to find her. The body itself can give a lot of clues as to what happened.
So just hours after the initial tip came in, the second search for Maria began, this time in the remote stretches of San Diego's East County.
It is vast. There is this rocky terrain.
However, just hours into the search, one veteran investigator noticed something, a roadside culvert that looked promising.
It being so close to the road, it was a high probability area for a body dump.
So following his hunch, he walked out to the culvert and peered down inside it.
There's a moment of pause when you physically and literally just stop and stare. It's almost like, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing?
Because at the bottom of the culvert lay what little remained of the missing woman.
It was just basically a torso.
She was still wearing her nightie, and she was still wearing jewelry.
I felt fairly confident I had found Maria.
The police sent the body off for an autopsy, and a few hours later, investigators arrived on Ghazal's front porch with a search warrant for her house and car.
He explained to her, look, you can't be in the house while the search is going on.
So while Ghazal waited outside,
She was not in custody. She was not being interviewed.
the forensic team stepped into what could only be described as a drug den.
They were shocked at how filthy it was.
The smell of rotting food was overwhelming.
The dishes were broken or tossed around. There's feces, dog feces, on the Persian rug. The Persian silk rug brought all the way from Afghanistan by my aunt.
And nearby, behind what the investigators figured was Maria's favorite chair.
She had mail there. She had some of her belongings there.
The investigators found some suspicious stains.
It was a positive test for blood.
Maria's chair wasn't the only place that tested positive for blood residue either. Investigators also found a set of footprints leading to the bathroom.
The footprints indicated that whomever walked in that hallway had blood on the bottom of their shoes.
The investigators found more blood in the back of Ghazal's car.
Blood was found in and around the latch area of the trunk and on the rubber lining of the trunk.
That wasn't all they found in the trunk, though.
There was also a bike inner tube.
The inner tube, the trunk, and the blood behind Maria's chair. It all appeared to match the story that Ghazal's friend had told the police.
Everything seemed to be able to fit into its place.
And the next day, October 3rd, after DNA confirmed that the body from the East County culvert was Maria, the San Diego police placed her daughter under arrest for murder. Coming up, will a new witness strengthen the prosecution's case at trial?
She believed that she had seen Ghazal.
Or will the defense's take change everything?
No one knows how she died.
On January 8, 2015, 44-year-old Ghazal Mansury stood trial for murder in San Diego, California. Clean, sober, and well-dressed, she was a world away from the dirty and disheveled drug addict that had first greeted the police at her mother's door.
She would be very respectful to the judge and to anyone else.
But the reason she was in court was the ultimate form of disrespect. Ghazal was charged with the 2013 murder of her 79-year-old mother.
This is such an unusual case. You don't usually hear about a daughter killing their mother.
And that was especially true of the city's Middle Eastern community.
in the Middle Eastern community for a daughter to be accused of killing her mother. No one has ever heard of such a thing.
So why had Ghazal done the unthinkable? In his opening statement, the prosecutor said it all came down to one thing: Ghazal's addiction to methamphetamines.
Her focus is on how to get access to that drug. And anything or anyone that stands in my way of that is the enemy.
And according to the prosecutor, it was no secret who Ghazal's #1 enemy was.
Her mother was the person who would try the hardest to stand in the way.
That they had a terrible relationship. They didn't like each other.
Neighbors interviewed would oftentimes overhear loud arguments between the two of them.
Arguments where witnesses said Ghazal regularly turned disrespectful.
Bitch. That's how she referred to her mother.
I did focus on the use of the word bitch because I think that's a very powerful word. It's an angry word. It's a derogatory word.
Was it all that much of a leap, the prosecutors asked, to believe that Ghazal had also physically abused her mother?
To me, it was consistent that if the daughter would refer to her mother as that bitch, then it was also very logical that she would slap her, push her, hit her.
And according to the prosecutor, Ghazal's abuse was ultimately why she killed her mother.
Ghazal did not want her mother to go to the doctor's appointment with such physical injuries, which would have been noticed by the doctor and therefore would have been reported.
And that was more than just a theory. During the investigation, the police had found a witness who told them the whole story.
Ghazal admitted to one person only that she had murdered her mother. And that person was a close drug-using friend called Trisha.
This was a real break for investigators.
Obviously, one of the key witnesses in the whole trial was going to be Trisha.
But when the trial came, the prosecution's star witness was a no-show.
Patricia just completely blew off the subpoena.
Not that the prosecutors would let her blow it off and get away with it.
They had to find her and bring her into court.
We actually placed her in custody.
Which meant that when she was finally called to the witness stand, things didn't exactly get off to an auspicious start.
She was literally brought through the back door in custody in jail uniforms.
And once she took the stand, the prosecutor couldn't help but wonder, would his decision to put the uncooperative drug addict on the stand blow up in his face?
My heart was pounding because you never know how this person is going to answer your questions.
But in the end, Trisha came through, telling the jury exactly what she'd told the police about Ghazal's alleged confession.
Ghazal disclosed to Patricia that she had gotten into an argument with her mother.
She told me that she killed her mom.
How did she kill her?
She strangled her mother.
She was murdered in her own home, wearing her nightie, and then dumped into this dry creek bed and abandoned there.
The prosecution offered up plenty of other evidence to back up Trisha's story, too. The blood in the house, plus the blood and the inner tube that the investigators found in the trunk of Ghazal's car.
That narrative was consistent with the other evidence.
However, there was one problem with Trisha's narrative: the person who delivered it.
She's a drug user. She's got a criminal record.
You lie to law enforcement, sir.
I lie to everybody.
Her testimony is completely unreliable.
Unfortunately for the defense, the prosecutors had another witness.
After the body was found, a person who lived about 3 miles from where the body was discovered saw a photo of Ghazal on the TV news coverage and said, "I recognize that person."
She believed that she had seen Ghazal near where the body was ultimately discovered.
According to the witness's testimony, she'd seen Ghazal driving down a remote road in East County around the time Maria disappeared.
This person lives on a very, very remote road where there's hardly any traffic. So it was unusual for her to see a car coming in the opposite direction. And she identified Ghazal as being the female that she saw in a car coming towards her.
So how would the defense refute that claim? As it turned out, they didn't.
She did admit to actually taking the body out of the house and disposing of the body.
The theory of our case has always been accidental death.
In fact, the defense opened its case by pointing out that when she conducted Maria's autopsy, the medical examiner had been unable to determine a cause of death.
There's no forensics to dispute that it was an accident, not one. The medical examiner does not know. No one knows how she died.
The only reason why she concluded the manner of death is homicide is based on the circumstances of where the body was found.
And to explain just how Maria had allegedly died, the defense turned to the only person who was there, her daughter. When Ghazal took the stand, she testified that she had been frantically rushing around the house on the morning of her mother's death, trying to get ready for her job volunteering at the church. And Ghazal said that when she went into the bathroom, she'd pushed open the door, not realizing her mother was already inside.
She explained that it hit her mother. Her mother then fell and also hit her head on the sink in the bathroom.
Ghazal said that her mother had been bleeding when she helped her up, but otherwise, Maria had seemed fine.
Her mother tells her everything's okay, you can go to work.
Ghazal apparently had some trepidation about leaving, but she said she did so anyway because she didn't want to upset her mother further.
So she goes into the garage, she does some methamphetamine, goes to work.
But when she'd come home at noon to check on Maria,
she said, I found my mother in the bathroom, dead.
And again, in this, meth-induced state, she panics.
She said, I thought that all my family would think I killed my mother.
So rather than calling the police, Ghazal said that she had rounded up a couple of her addict friends.
They do drugs, and they decide to dump the body.
On the stand, Ghazal admitted that it was a mistake.
She said it was ridiculous, it was stupid, but this is how I was behaving because of the drugs.
But Ghazal maintained that when it came to her mother's death, she was innocent.
Cleaning up a crime scene in no way equates to a first-degree murder.
That's what the defense claimed, but on cross, the prosecutor was quick to go on the attack.
The prosecutor was really trying to hammer her, tell her, these are lies. Aren't you telling lies to this jury?
No reasonable person would accept that a daughter would find her mother dead from an accident and then dump her where coyotes can get to her.
And much like when crossed by her mother, Ghazal's temper flared.
On cross-examination, I think her real personality came through. She was being confrontational.
But while she did raise her voice, Ghazal's story never changed.
Answering each question, she would say, well, no, this is what happened, and I'm not proud of it.
That was the defense, that Ghazal was a person who, in her own words, had been trapped by the drug of methamphetamine.
Coming up, the case goes to the jury.
The worst part is waiting for the deliberations to be over.
But what will the outcome be?
For all these other emotions gush in.
On January 27, 2015, Ghazal Mansury waited in a San Diego courtroom for the verdict in her murder trial. The 44-year-old former meth addict had been accused of abusing and then killing her elderly mother, 79-year-old Maria Mansury. And her extended family demanded justice.
The trial was packed. It was full of family members, very emotional.
This is all about Maria's life, about a woman who did not deserve to be murdered by her own daughter.
She is so sorely missed. Our get-togethers are not the same. Always there's a chair vacant for her. Always will be.
At trial, Ghazal had claimed her mother's death had been a tragic accident.
That she opens the door in the bathroom, that she accidentally hits her mother, and she panics and disposes of the body.
She tried to blame everything on the drugs.
But would the jury agree? After 6 hours of deliberation, jurors announced that they had reached a verdict.
The worst part of the whole trial is waiting for the deliberations to be over.
For the prosecutor, perhaps, but not Ghazal.
She was found guilty.
Judging by the relative speed in which the jury reached their verdict, I think it was pretty clear that they felt that she was lying in her testimony.
Maria's family was relieved.
All these other emotions gush in.
But they were also disappointed.
I want Ghazal to say that she did it, acknowledge it.
Not that she said any such thing or had any real reaction to the verdict at all.
Throughout the trial, Ghazal was very controlled.
And she remained just as tight-lipped on March 6th when the judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 25 years.
Frankly, I wouldn't have felt bad if they had decided to hang her. Somebody that is that horrible and that cruel. I don't think she deserves any more time of life on this earth.
Maria's relatives aren't quite as hungry for vengeance, however, because even though Ghazal was guilty of murder, she's still family.
My feeling for Ghazal is between love and hate. I love her, but I hate her for what she has done.
There are places where silence feels peaceful, and there are places where silence hides something far darker. In the spring of 1971, the orchards of Sutter County, California, appeared to belong to the first kind. Stretching across the fertile Sacramento Valley, rows of peach, pear, plum, and walnut trees formed an endless patchwork of green. Dirt roads divided the orchards into neat sections, and during the harvest season, hundreds of seasonal laborers moved through the fields each day, pruning branches, carrying ladders, and loading fruit onto trucks destined for markets across the country. To anyone passing through, it looked like another ordinary farming community built on hard work and routine. Yet beneath that ordinary landscape, something unimaginable had been waiting to be discovered. Beneath the roots of fruit trees, hidden beneath freshly turned soil, lay a secret that would shock California and transform what began as a routine investigation into one of the largest homicide inquiries the state had ever witnessed. The story did not begin with flashing police lights or a dramatic manhunt. It began with disturbed earth. On May 19, 1971, the owner of a peach orchard noticed something unusual. A patch of soil appeared freshly dug. In farmland, disturbed dirt was not uncommon. Holes were dug for irrigation, fence repairs, and countless agricultural tasks. But something about this particular spot seemed different. It did not belong. The following day, the soil appeared to have been covered again, as though someone had deliberately attempted to erase any sign that the ground had ever been opened. Suspicion replaced curiosity. The landowner contacted law enforcement, believing there might be a reason to investigate. At first, no one imagined that this call would become the beginning of a case remembered decades later as one of the darkest chapters in California's criminal history. Investigators arrived expecting the possibility of finding a single victim. Cases involving isolated graves were rare, but not unheard of. Perhaps it would be one homicide, one unidentified man whose story had ended in violence somewhere far from home. Instead, as officers dug into the soil, they uncovered the body of a man who had suffered devastating injuries. The discovery alone was horrifying, but it was only the beginning. As investigators surveyed the surrounding orchard, They noticed more patches of freshly disturbed earth. Another excavation began, then another. Each new hole revealed another victim. Within days, the search expanded far beyond the first grave. Heavy machinery was brought into the orchards. Search dogs joined investigators. Aircraft equipped with infrared technology were used to identify additional areas where the ground had recently been disturbed. Every day seemed to bring another discovery. The number of victims continued to rise. 2 bodies became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 18. Then 21. Finally, investigators confirmed the existence of 25 victims buried in shallow graves scattered throughout orchards and nearby agricultural land. The quiet farming community had become the center of one of the most disturbing investigations in American history. For years afterward, the Juan Corona murders would be remembered as the largest known serial murder case in the United States until another notorious investigation emerged in 1973. Yet the growing body count raised a question that seemed almost impossible to answer. How could 25 men disappear without provoking immediate alarm? How could one person allegedly kill again and again over several months while remaining almost invisible to law enforcement? The answer lay not only in the actions of the accused, but also in the lives of the victims themselves. These were not wealthy businessmen, politicians, or public figures. Most were seasonal agricultural workers. Some were immigrants searching for temporary employment. Others drifted from town to town following harvest seasons. Some had no permanent address. Some had no close relatives nearby. Others lived in inexpensive boarding houses or labor camps where people came and went constantly. In Northern California during the early 1970s, thousands of men traveled wherever work could be found. They harvested fruit one month and searched for another job the next. Many lived alone. Many owned little more than the clothes they carried. If one worker failed to appear one morning, it was easy to assume he had simply moved on to another town in search of employment. Days passed, then weeks. In many cases, no missing person report was filed because there was no one who realized the man was gone. The victims shared another common characteristic. They trusted the promise of work. California's agricultural economy depended on labor contractors, individuals responsible for recruiting workers and connecting them with farm owners who needed seasonal help. These contractors transported laborers, arranged jobs, and often became the first people newcomers encountered when arriving in farming communities. Among them was a man named Juan Corona. Born in Mexico in 1934 before immigrating to California, Corona worked as a labor contractor in the orchards surrounding Yuba City and Sutter County. His occupation gave him daily contact with hundreds of seasonal workers. He knew who had recently arrived. He knew who had just been paid. He knew who traveled alone and who lacked family nearby. According to investigators, those circumstances would later become central to understanding how so many men vanished. At this point in the investigation, however, none of that was yet known to the public. Residents watched news reports with disbelief as body after body was recovered from beneath orchard soil. Rumors spread quickly throughout farming communities. Workers wondered whether friends who had quietly disappeared months earlier might now be among the dead. Families living hundreds of miles away began recognizing names released by authorities. Others waited anxiously for identification, fearing that relatives who had stopped writing letters or making telephone calls had become victims as well. The orchards themselves became scenes of relentless activity. Investigators carefully marked each grave. Every excavation represented another attempt to restore an identity to someone whose life had ended. Anonymously beneath fruit trees, every recovered body represented another unanswered question. Who was this man? When had he arrived in Sutter County? Had anyone been waiting for him to return? Or had his disappearance passed unnoticed because no one knew where he had gone? As investigators worked, another realization slowly emerged. The graves were not hidden in distant wilderness or remote mountains. They were located in working orchards, places where people labored every day. The bodies had been buried in relatively shallow graves, often only a short distance from one another. The discovery suggested that whoever was responsible possessed confidence, familiarity with the area, and the ability to move through these agricultural landscapes without attracting suspicion. It was a chilling thought. Someone had apparently been operating within this farming community while surrounded by ordinary daily life. Farmers tended their crops. Trucks transported fruit. Workers harvested orchards. All the while, beneath the soil, victims remained undiscovered. As the investigation expanded, authorities faced a race against time. Each new grave raised the possibility that others still remained hidden. Every patch of disturbed earth demanded examination. Every missing worker became a potential victim. Detectives understood they were no longer investigating a single homicide. They were confronting a pattern unlike anything California had previously experienced. The scale of the case would test investigators, challenge prosecutors, and leave behind questions that even decades later would never receive complete answers. At the center of it all stood a labor contractor whose profession placed him among the very people who had become the victims. But before investigators could understand how 25 men came to be buried beneath the orchards of Sutter County, they first needed to understand the world in which those men had lived, a world built on seasonal work, constant movement, fragile livelihoods, and lives that could disappear with almost no one noticing until it was already far too late. To understand how 25 men could disappear over the course of only a few months, it is necessary to step away from the crime scene itself and examine the place where it happened, long before investigators uncovered the first grave, before the name Juan Corona appeared in newspaper headlines across America. Sutter County was known for something entirely different. Located in Northern California near the city of Yuba City, the region was recognized for its fertile farmland. Every season, thousands of acres of orchards produced peaches, pears, plums, walnuts, and other crops that depended on an enormous workforce. Agriculture was not simply one industry among many. It was the foundation of the local economy. Entire communities revolved around planting, harvesting, transporting, and selling fruit. From sunrise until sunset, orchards filled with workers carrying ladders between rows of trees, loading crates onto trucks, and preparing harvests that would eventually reach grocery stores hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The landscape appeared peaceful. Neatly organized rows of trees stretched toward the horizon. Dirt roads connected one orchard to another. Farmhouses sat quietly among fields that had remained productive for generations. Visitors often described the Sacramento Valley as calm and picturesque, a place where life followed the rhythm of the growing season rather than the pace of large cities. Yet beneath that peaceful appearance existed another reality, one that rarely attracted public attention. Every harvest required labor, and every labor force required people willing to travel wherever work could be found. During the early 1970s, Northern California drew thousands of seasonal workers every year. Some arrived from neighboring counties. Others came from different states. Many crossed the border from Mexico seeking temporary employment. Some had recently been released from prison and hoped agricultural work would provide a fresh start. Others were homeless men drifting from town to town, accepting whatever jobs became available. There were older men who had outlived their families, individuals with no permanent residence, and workers who spent nearly every month of the year following crops from one farming region to another. Despite their different backgrounds, these men shared something important. They lived temporary lives. Few expected to remain in Sutter County for long. Once the harvest ended, another town, another orchard, or another opportunity would call them elsewhere. Their existence was defined by movement. They traveled light, owned little, and often knew only a handful of people wherever they happened to be working. Many stayed in inexpensive boarding houses or temporary labor camps located close to the orchards. These accommodations were functional rather than comfortable. Workers arrived, slept, left before sunrise, returned exhausted, collected their wages, and eventually moved on when another job appeared. New faces replaced old ones constantly. Someone disappearing from one boarding house did not automatically raise concern because departures were an ordinary part of daily life. In many cases, fellow workers assumed a missing man had simply accepted employment somewhere else. This constant movement created a tragic vulnerability. Today, when someone disappears unexpectedly, friends and family often notice almost immediately. Telephone calls go unanswered. Employers report unexplained absences. Financial activity suddenly stops. But the world of seasonal agricultural labor in 1971 functioned differently. Many workers had no permanent address. Some had no telephone. Communication with relatives, if they had any nearby, was often infrequent. Weeks could pass between letters or conversations. If someone failed to appear at work, employers frequently assumed he had found another job. If he left his room at a boarding house, the landlord might simply rent the bed to another laborer within days. There was rarely a formal record of arrivals and departures. The system depended on mobility, and mobility meant people constantly vanished from one place only to appear somewhere else. That pattern made genuine disappearances remarkably difficult to recognize. Among the many people seeking employment were immigrants from Mexico. Some had lived in California for years. Others had arrived more recently, hoping to earn enough money to support themselves or their families. Language barriers sometimes isolated them further, limiting their ability to report problems or establish lasting relationships within the communities where they worked. Alongside them were American-born laborers whose circumstances were equally uncertain. Homelessness, poverty age, and unstable employment created lives that existed largely beyond public attention. Many of these men shared another characteristic. They often carried their wages in cash. After completing days or weeks of physically demanding labor, they received payment and prepared to continue traveling. Cash was practical because many lacked bank accounts or permanent mailing addresses. For someone searching for vulnerable victims, workers carrying recently earned wages represented easy targets. They possessed money, but often lacked anyone who would immediately notice if they disappeared. Within this environment, labor contractors played a critical role. Orchard owners depended on them to recruit workers quickly whenever additional labor became necessary. Contractors located available workers, arranged transportation, connected laborers with employers, and sometimes handled wage-related responsibilities or acted as intermediaries between farm owners and employees. Seasonal workers frequently trusted these contractors because they represented opportunity. A contractor arriving with news of available work could mean several more weeks of income. Accepting a ride in a pickup truck or following directions to another orchard was not unusual. It was part of everyday life. According to investigators, this ordinary relationship would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The occupation that gave one individual legitimate access to vulnerable workers also provided opportunities that few others possessed. A labor contractor naturally knew who was searching for employment. He knew who had recently arrived in town. He knew who traveled alone. He knew which workers had just received wages. He also understood something that outsiders rarely considered. Many of these men had almost no one watching over them. If they disappeared after accepting an offer of work, there might be no immediate investigation because there might be no one available to report them missing. This reality became painfully clear only after investigators began identifying the victims. Discovered beneath the orchards. Most of the recovered bodies belonged to men who fit the same general profile. They were middle-aged, often between 40 and 60 years old. They had been living alone or traveling independently. Many were seasonal laborers or individuals searching for agricultural employment. They represented people who formed the invisible foundation of California's farming economy. Every year they harvested crops that fed countless families, yet their own lives often remained largely unnoticed outside the communities where they briefly worked. As investigators reconstructed the victims' final movements, another pattern emerged. Witnesses later recalled seeing several of the missing men entering Juan Corona's pickup truck. At the time, nothing about those encounters appeared suspicious. A labor contractor transporting workers was performing an entirely ordinary task. No alarm was raised because no alarm seemed necessary. That normality became one of the greatest advantages available to the alleged killer. Trust existed before any crime was committed. The promise of employment did not appear deceptive because employment genuinely existed throughout. The orchards. A ride to another farm did not appear dangerous because transportation between work sites occurred every day. Ordinary routines concealed extraordinary violence. The geography of Sutter County further contributed to the difficulty of detecting what was happening. Orchards covered enormous areas of land. Long rows of trees limited visibility, creating natural barriers that separated one section from another. Dirt roads wound through agricultural property, connecting fields that often appeared deserted outside working hours. Certain areas near the Feather River and within isolated orchards received little regular traffic. Investigators later determined that bodies had been buried in shallow graves within these agricultural landscapes, locations familiar to someone accustomed to working there. Yet at the time, nothing suggested that these quiet orchards concealed multiple burial sites. Farming continued. Harvest schedules continued. Daily routines continued. Life moved forward above ground while hidden evidence accumulated beneath it. The tragedy of the Juan Corona murders cannot be measured only by the number of victims. It must also be understood through the circumstances that allowed those victims to become almost invisible. These men were not forgotten because their lives lacked value. They were overlooked because they lived within a system built upon constant movement and temporary employment. Their absence blended into patterns that already existed. A missing worker could easily be mistaken for another traveler pursuing the next harvest. A vacated room could quickly be occupied by someone new. Days became weeks, and weeks became months before anyone realized that some of those men had not moved on at all. They had simply vanished. This vulnerable world, shaped by poverty, migration, and the relentless demands of agricultural labor, created the conditions in which one of California's most notorious serial murder cases unfolded. It was within this environment that Juan Corona lived and worked every day, surrounded by orchards that depended upon the labor of men whose disappearances could remain unnoticed far longer than anyone believed possible. Before investigators would begin connecting the growing list of victims to a single suspect, they first had to understand the man whose profession placed him at the center of this fragile and transient community. As investigators continued uncovering graves across the orchards of Sutter County, one question became increasingly urgent. Who could have committed crimes on such a scale without attracting immediate suspicion? The answer, investigators believed, lay with a man who did not appear to be an outsider passing briefly through the region. Instead, he was someone whose daily work placed him at the very center of the agricultural community. His name was Juan Vallejo Corona. Born in 1934 in the Mexican state of Jalisco, Corona later immigrated to California during the 1950s, joining countless others who sought new opportunities in the state's expanding agricultural economy. Like many immigrants of his generation, he found work connected to farming, an industry that depended heavily on physical labor and seasonal employment. Over time, Corona became more than an ordinary farm worker. He established himself as a labor contractor, a position carrying significant responsibility within the orchards surrounding Yuba City and Sutter County. The title itself sounded routine, even unremarkable, but the role placed him in daily contact with hundreds of men searching for work. Orchard owners relied on labor contractors whenever additional workers were needed. Rather than recruiting individuals themselves, growers often depended on contractors to assemble crews, transport laborers to different orchards, and ensure enough workers were available to meet the demands of the harvest. For seasonal laborers arriving in Northern California with little money and no permanent employment, labor contractors frequently became the first point of contact. They knew where jobs existed, who was hiring, and when workers were needed. To many laborers, following a contractor's instructions was simply part of finding a livelihood. According to investigators, Corona's responsibilities included recruiting farm workers, transporting laborers, and acting as an intermediary between growers and employees. Every working day, he interacted with men whose lives were often defined by uncertainty. He learned their names, knew where they stayed, and understood who had recently arrived in the area. He also became familiar with details that would later assume enormous importance during the investigation. He knew which workers traveled alone. He knew who lacked nearby family. He knew who had recently received wages in cash. He knew who was desperate enough to accept nearly any offer of employment. These were ordinary pieces of information for someone performing his job. Yet prosecutors would later argue that this knowledge also gave him access to an unusually vulnerable population. Unlike strangers, Corona did not need elaborate schemes to approach seasonal workers. Conversations about employment happened naturally. Offering transportation to another orchard raised little suspicion because transporting workers was one of his legitimate duties. A man entering Corona's pickup truck did not appear unusual to witnesses. It looked like another worker heading toward another day's labor. Several witnesses would later tell investigators that they had seen victims climbing into Corona's truck before those men disappeared. At the time, none of those encounters seemed remarkable. Only after bodies began emerging from shallow graves did those ordinary moments take on a far more disturbing significance. Yet understanding Juan Corona required examining more than his occupation alone. During the investigation and subsequent trials, another part of his history became the subject of intense legal debate. Years before the murders, Corona had experienced serious mental health problems. According to the information presented during the case, he was hospitalized in 1956 after displaying symptoms that included paranoia, hearing voices, prolonged insomnia, and unusual behavior. Medical professionals treated him with antipsychotic medication before eventually releasing him from the hospital. Those events occurred more than a decade before the crimes for which he would later be convicted, but they remained central to the arguments presented in court. The existence of this psychiatric history did not automatically answer questions about criminal responsibility. Instead, it created one of the most contested issues in the legal proceedings. Defense attorneys argued that Corona suffered from significant mental illness. They maintained that his psychiatric history demonstrated long-standing psychological problems that should be considered when evaluating his actions. Prosecutors, however, presented a different interpretation. While acknowledging his earlier hospitalization, they argued that Corona remained capable of understanding his conduct and should therefore be held fully responsible for the crimes. Ultimately, the court did not conclude that his previous treatment rendered him incapable of criminal responsibility. The debate over his mental condition remained unresolved in a broader sense. And even decades later, there has never been universal agreement regarding how much, if any, role mental illness played in the murders. That uncertainty extended beyond the courtroom. One of the enduring aspects of the Juan Corona case is that investigators never established a single, universally accepted motive. Various theories were discussed over the years, including explosive violence, a possible sexual motive, hostility toward homosexual men, and the influence of mental illness. None of these explanations, however, achieved definitive consensus. Unlike some criminal cases in which offenders openly described their motivations, the Juan Corona investigation left many questions unanswered. The available evidence established connections between Corona and the victims, but it did not produce a clear explanation for why 25 men were allegedly selected and killed over the course of only a few months. The absence of a definitive motive has continued to shape discussions of the case ever since. Investigators instead focused on what they could establish through evidence rather than speculation. They examined Corona's movements, his occupation, his access to victims, and the circumstances surrounding each disappearance. What emerged was a portrait not necessarily of a man who stood apart from the community, but one who blended into it. Corona's daily routine did not appear extraordinary. He worked within the same agricultural system that employed thousands of seasonal laborers. He traveled between orchards. He met workers searching for jobs. He interacted with growers who required additional manpower. Everything about his public role seemed consistent with the demands of the farming industry. That apparent normality would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the investigation. It suggested that the alleged offender operated within the ordinary rhythms of agricultural life, rather than outside them. Every day offered opportunities to encounter new workers. Every conversation about employment could involve someone with no permanent address and few personal connections. Every pickup truck journey across the orchards appeared routine to anyone observing from a distance. Prosecutors would later argue that this environment allowed Corona to identify particularly vulnerable individuals with remarkable ease. Seasonal workers often arrive carrying everything they owned. Many depended entirely upon obtaining immediate employment. Turning down a contractor's offer might mean losing the chance to earn enough money for food or lodging. Accepting transportation from someone responsible for arranging work was not an act of unusual trust. It was a practical decision made countless times by laborers throughout California's farming regions. According to the investigation, Corona understood this reality better than almost anyone because he participated in it every day. His profession required him to know the agricultural community in detail. He understood the schedules of harvest seasons, the movement of workers, and the constant arrival and departure of temporary laborers. Those ordinary responsibilities, prosecutors argued, also created opportunities that few others possessed. The more investigators examined the victims, the clearer these patterns became. Most of the men recovered from the orchards fit remarkably similar profiles. They were middle-aged, generally between 40 and 60 years old. Many traveled alone. Many sought temporary agricultural employment. Several had recently been paid. None occupied positions likely to generate immediate public attention if they disappeared. Investigators believed these similarities were not coincidental. They suggested deliberate selection rather than random violence. If that conclusion was correct, then Corona's occupation provided an explanation for how such selection could occur. He did not need to search extensively for potential victims because vulnerable men came to him in the ordinary course of business. Yet while investigators gradually assembled this picture, they still faced an enormous challenge. Suspicion alone could not support criminal charges. They needed evidence linking Corona directly to the disappearances and the burial sites scattered throughout Sutter County. That evidence would eventually emerge through witness statements, documents recovered near graves, and items seized during a search of Corona's residence. But at this stage of the investigation, those discoveries still lay ahead. What authorities possessed instead was a growing awareness that the man at the center of the agricultural labor network occupied a unique position. He had access, opportunity, and familiarity with both the victims and the landscape in which they disappeared. The peaceful orchards of Northern California had already surrendered 25 bodies. The next phase of the investigation would determine whether they would also reveal the evidence necessary to identify the person responsible. By the time investigators began reconstructing the events that unfolded between February and May of 1971, they realized that the victims' disappearances had not been isolated tragedies. Instead, they formed a pattern that stretched across several months, connecting men who had never known one another, but whose lives followed remarkably similar paths. The investigation suggested that the murders occurred during a relatively short period. Yet the impact was devastating. 25 men would ultimately be identified as victims, each representing an individual who had traveled to Northern California with the hope of earning a living through seasonal agricultural work. Their stories did not begin with violence. They began with opportunity. During every harvest season, workers arrived in Sutter County searching for employment. Some came after hearing that orchards needed additional labor. Others had followed the harvest from another region, moving wherever fruit was ready to be picked. The work was physically demanding, but it offered a chance to earn money, even if only temporarily. Men gathered near labor camps, inexpensive boarding houses, and places where contractors were known to recruit workers. Conversations about available jobs happened constantly. Information traveled by word of mouth. A recommendation from another laborer or a simple promise of work could determine where someone spent the following day. According to investigators, this ordinary process became the first step in the chain of events that led to the murders. Juan Corona, working as a labor contractor, possessed a legitimate reason to approach men searching for employment. His responsibilities involved recruiting workers for farms, transporting them to orchards, and connecting growers with laborers. Because these activities were part of his daily routine, nothing appeared suspicious when he spoke with workers or offered them transportation. Investigators later concluded that many victims were approached through these ordinary interactions. The offers themselves appeared simple. There was work available. Transportation could be provided. Payment would follow after the job was completed. For men who depended upon temporary employment, such offers represented hope rather than danger. Witnesses later recalled seeing several victims entering Corona's pickup truck before they disappeared. At the time, those observations attracted no attention. A labor contractor transporting workers was a familiar sight throughout Northern California's agricultural communities. No one watching those departures had reason to believe they would become the final confirmed sightings of the men involved. The truck disappeared along rural roads bordered by orchards, carrying workers toward locations where they expected another day of labor. According to the investigation, instead of arriving at legitimate work sites, many victims were taken to isolated areas within orchards or nearby land where few people would be present. The geography of Sutter County made such locations easy to find. Rows of fruit trees extended across large areas, separated by dirt roads and open spaces that received little traffic outside normal working hours. Investigators believed that these secluded environments became the settings where the attacks occurred. The physical evidence recovered from the victims revealed a consistent and exceptionally violent pattern. Most of the men had suffered repeated attacks involving knives or a machete. Medical examinations showed extensive injuries concentrated around the head and neck. Many victims sustained numerous wounds, indicating repeated blows rather than a single fatal strike. Several skulls displayed severe fractures caused by powerful impacts. Some victims had also suffered multiple stab wounds to the chest and back. One victim was determined to have died from a gunshot wound to the head, making that case different from the others while still fitting within the broader sequence of killings. Although investigators could not determine the precise chronology of every attack, the injuries demonstrated an extraordinary level of violence. Many victims bore between 20 and 30 wounds. The repeated nature of those injuries suggested prolonged assaults rather than brief confrontations. Yet despite the brutality reflected in the forensic examinations, investigators remained careful not to speculate beyond what the evidence established. The available facts showed how the victims died, but they did not fully explain why they had been selected or what had motivated the attacks. That uncertainty would remain one of the defining features of the case. After each killing, investigators believe the offender undertook another deliberate step intended to conceal the crime. Shallow graves were dug within orchards and nearby agricultural land, including areas close to the Feather River. These graves generally measured approximately 1 to 1.5 meters in depth. Rather than transporting bodies over great distances, the victims were buried close to where investigators believed the killings had occurred. Most were still wearing their clothing when recovered, indicating there had been no significant attempt to remove personal items or otherwise alter the condition of the bodies before burial. The simplicity of the burial method proved striking. The graves were not elaborate. They were relatively shallow and covered with earth intended to blend into the surrounding landscape. In some locations, graves lay only a short distance apart, separated by mere meters. Such proximity suggested familiarity with the area and confidence that the burial sites would remain undiscovered despite existing within active agricultural property. For weeks and even months, that confidence appeared justified. Farming operations continued above ground while the victims remained hidden beneath the soil. The routine activity of the orchards inadvertently concealed the evidence. Workers harvested fruit. Trucks carried produce away from the fields. Growers supervised daily operations. Meanwhile, beneath rows of productive trees, graves accumulated unnoticed. Investigators later recognized that the agricultural environment itself played an important role in delaying discovery. Freshly disturbed soil could easily be mistaken for ordinary farming activity. Heavy equipment regularly altered the landscape. Irrigation projects, planting, and maintenance frequently involved digging. Unless someone happened to notice a particularly unusual patch of earth, there was little reason to suspect that a burial had taken place. At the same time, the victims' disappearances generated surprisingly little immediate concern. Each missing man fit a profile common among seasonal laborers. They traveled frequently. They often accepted short-term employment before moving elsewhere. Many lacked permanent addresses or close family nearby. If a worker failed to return to a boarding house, others commonly assumed he had found another job in another community. If someone disappeared after receiving wages, fellow laborers often believed he had continued following the harvest to another county or another state. These assumptions, entirely reasonable under ordinary circumstances, unintentionally provided additional time before anyone realized that something far more sinister had occurred. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they concluded that the murders likely continued over approximately 3 months, beginning around February 1971 and ending in May of that year. During this period, no public awareness existed that a serial killer might be operating within Sutter County. There were no widespread warnings to seasonal workers because authorities had not yet recognized any pattern linking disappearances together. Each missing individual remained, at least initially, an isolated absence. Only after the discovery of multiple graves did investigators understand that those separate disappearances belonged to the same sequence of events. Looking back, the pattern appeared disturbingly clear. The victims shared similar backgrounds, similar occupations, similar vulnerabilities, and according to witness testimony, similar last known encounters with Juan Corona. But while those connections seem obvious in retrospect, they emerged only gradually during the investigation. At the time the crimes were occurring, there was no obvious signal indicating that dozens of men faced extraordinary danger. Life in the orchards continued according to familiar routines. Workers still searched for jobs. Contractors continued transporting laborers. Orchard owners focused on the demands of the harvest. The murders remained hidden because they were woven into the ordinary activities of agricultural life. Investigators also noted another important characteristic of the case. The burial sites demonstrated no significant effort to move victims far from the places where they were believed to have been killed. Instead, the bodies remained within the same agricultural environment connected to the victims' work. This detail suggested that concealment relied less upon distance than upon anonymity. The victims disappeared into landscapes where temporary laborers constantly arrived and departed, and where freshly disturbed ground could escape notice for weeks. It was not an elaborate strategy, but for several months it proved tragically effective. The murders continued until chance interrupted the pattern. The discovery of disturbed soil by an observant orchard owner on May 19, 1971 transformed what had remained hidden into a rapidly expanding criminal investigation. The first grave led investigators to another, then another, until the orchard surrendered evidence that could no longer remain buried. As the number of recovered victims climbed from 1 to 25, attention shifted from identifying the dead to identifying the individual responsible. The next phase of the case would focus on tracing the victim's final movements, examining the physical evidence left behind, and following a series of investigative leads that would ultimately point toward the labor contractor whose name had begun appearing again and again throughout the growing investigation. For nearly 3 months, the orchards of Sutter County concealed a tragedy that no one yet understood. Men disappeared one by one, and their absences blended into the constant movement that defined seasonal agricultural life. Workers arrived looking for employment, stayed briefly, and often left for another harvest somewhere else. Because this pattern was so common, there was little reason to believe that something extraordinary was unfolding beneath the rows of peach and pear trees. The turning point came not through a planned police operation or a breakthrough from a long-running investigation, but because one observant orchard owner noticed something that did not seem quite right. On May 19, 1971, while moving through a peach orchard in Sutter County, the landowner observed a patch of earth that appeared freshly disturbed. In an agricultural setting, recently turned soil was hardly unusual. Farmers dug trenches, repaired irrigation systems, replaced fence posts, and performed countless tasks requiring excavation. Yet this particular patch of ground drew attention. It seemed out of place. The disturbed earth did not appear connected to any routine farming activity that the owner recognized. Rather than ignoring the unusual sight, he remembered its location. The following day, when he returned to the same area, he noticed another detail that deepened his concern. The hole that had been visible the previous day had now been covered over. Instead of remaining open, the soil had been carefully replaced, as though someone had deliberately attempted to erase evidence that the ground had ever been disturbed. This sequence of events transformed curiosity into suspicion. Believing something unusual had occurred, the orchard owner contacted law enforcement and requested that officers examine the site. At that moment, no one involved could have imagined what lay beneath the surface. Responding officers approached the location expecting the possibility of recovering a single body. If their suspicions proved correct, they anticipated investigating one homicide, identifying one victim, and searching for one killer. Cases involving isolated clandestine graves were uncommon, but they fell within the experience of homicide investigators. Nothing suggested that this investigation would soon expand into one of the largest serial murder cases California had ever confronted. As officers began digging into the suspicious area, their fears were confirmed. Beneath the soil lay the body of a man who had suffered severe injuries consistent with a violent death. The discovery immediately transformed the orchard into an active crime scene. Investigators secured the area, documented the grave, and began the careful process of recovering evidence. At first, the focus remained on understanding the identity of the victim and determining how he had died. Yet as detectives examined the surrounding landscape, another unsettling possibility emerged. The first grave did not appear to be the only area where the ground had been disturbed. Additional patches of soil attracted attention. Some looked similar to the original burial site. Others appeared to have been recently excavated and then covered again. Investigators recognized that they could not ignore these locations. One by one, they began opening additional sections of earth. Each excavation carried the hope that suspicions would prove unfounded. Instead, each new grave deepened the horror. Another body was recovered, then another. The realization spread rapidly through the investigative team that they were no longer dealing with a single homicide. They were uncovering evidence of multiple killings. As more victims emerged from the orchards, authorities dramatically expanded the search. Resources increased almost immediately. Additional investigators arrived at the scene. The search extended beyond the original orchard into nearby agricultural properties where similar conditions existed. Detectives understood that if multiple graves had already been discovered, there was every possibility that others remained hidden across the surrounding landscape. The operation quickly evolved into one of the largest homicide excavations California had undertaken. The scale of the search reflected the growing urgency of the situation. Heavy machinery, including excavating equipment, was brought into the orchards to assist investigators in examining large areas of land more efficiently. Search dogs joined the operation, helping identify locations that might conceal additional graves. Authorities also employed aircraft equipped with infrared cameras in an effort to detect recently disturbed soil from above. The combination of ground searches, aerial observation, and mechanical excavation demonstrated how rapidly the investigation had expanded beyond anything originally anticipated. Every newly identified patch of disturbed earth became a possible burial site. Every excavation carried the possibility of another victim. As days passed, the number of recovered bodies continued to climb. Investigators initially recovered a second victim, confirming that the first grave had not been an isolated incident. Soon afterward came a third. Then the total rose to 5. Each new discovery reinforced the terrifying conclusion that the killings represented a systematic pattern rather than random acts of violence. The pace of the discoveries intensified. 10 victims were eventually recovered, then 18. Shortly afterward, investigators located 21 bodies. Finally, after more than 2 weeks of continuous searching, authorities confirmed the recovery of 25 victims buried across orchards and nearby agricultural land. The cumulative effect of these discoveries stunned both investigators and the public. Every recovered body represented another individual whose disappearance had gone largely unnoticed, until the graves themselves were uncovered. The orchards, once symbols of agricultural prosperity, had become vast outdoor crime scenes. Detectives faced the enormous responsibility of documenting each burial site individually while simultaneously searching for additional graves that might still remain hidden. The work demanded extraordinary patience. Each excavation required careful attention because evidence preserved within the graves could later prove essential in identifying victims, reconstructing events, and establishing connections between the crimes. At the same time, investigators confronted another difficult challenge. Identifying the victims would not be straightforward. Many had lived transient lives as seasonal laborers. Some lacked permanent addresses. Others maintained limited contact with relatives. Several had traveled alone. The very circumstances that had made them vulnerable during life now complicated efforts to restore their identities after death. Authorities worked methodically to determine who these men were, where they had come from, and when they had last been seen alive. As information slowly accumulated, patterns began emerging. Most victims were middle-aged men employed in seasonal agricultural work or searching for such employment. Many shared similar backgrounds marked by economic hardship, temporary housing, and constant movement between harvests. Investigators also recognized another tragic reality. The fact that so many victims remained undiscovered for months reflected not a lack of concern for human life, but the harsh conditions under which seasonal laborers often lived. In communities where workers routinely arrived and departed, absence alone rarely signaled danger. This understanding gradually reshaped the investigation. Detectives no longer viewed the graves as separate discoveries, but as parts of a larger narrative, involving vulnerable workers whose disappearances had blended into ordinary patterns of migration. While recovery operations continued, news of the growing body counts spread rapidly throughout California and beyond. Reports describing bodies buried beneath fruit orchards captured national attention. Residents of Yuba City and neighboring communities struggled to comprehend how such crimes could have occurred in an area long associated with farming rather than violence. Seasonal workers who remained in the region experienced growing fear as they realized that many of the victims had shared circumstances nearly identical to their own. Families elsewhere anxiously followed news reports, hoping that missing relatives would not appear among the list of recovered victims. The emotional burden on investigators also intensified. Unlike many homicide investigations involving a single victim, this operation required detectives to revisit scenes of death repeatedly. Every new excavation meant another family might soon receive devastating news. Every recovered body reminded investigators that someone had lived, worked, and hoped for a better future before disappearing beneath the orchards. Although public attention increasingly focused on the shocking number of victims, detectives remained committed to a more immediate objective. Recovering the bodies represented only one part of the investigation. The equally urgent task involved identifying the person responsible before additional lives could be lost. As forensic teams documented burial sites and investigators interviewed witnesses, crucial evidence slowly began pointing toward a single individual. Certain documents recovered near graves attracted attention. Witnesses described seeing victims with the same man shortly before they vanished. Farmers confirmed that one labor contractor regularly transported workers throughout the area. Individually, these observations might have appeared ordinary. Together, they formed the outline of a developing investigative theory. The search for graves had revealed the scale of the tragedy. The next phase of the investigation would determine whether the accumulating evidence could establish responsibility for one of the deadliest serial murder cases in California's history. As the recovery effort continued across the orchards of Sutter County, investigators faced a task far more complicated than simply documenting burial sites. 25 victims had now been recovered, transforming what had begun as a single homicide investigation into one of the largest criminal inquiries in California history. The challenge was no longer limited to identifying the dead. Detectives now had to answer a question that would determine the direction of the entire case. Who had been able to lure so many vulnerable men into isolated orchards, kill them over a period of several months, bury them beneath working farmland, and continue doing so without attracting immediate suspicion? Every grave became more than a burial site. Each one represented a potential source of evidence. Investigators understood that even seemingly insignificant objects recovered near the bodies might establish links capable of identifying the person responsible. The work proceeded methodically. Every location was carefully documented before excavation continued. Detectives examined the surrounding ground, cataloged personal belongings associated with victims, and searched for anything that appeared unrelated to the victims themselves. It was during this painstaking process that some of the first important investigative leads emerged. According to the evidence described in the case, investigators recovered receipts bearing one coroner's signature near some of the graves. On their own, such documents did not prove murder. A receipt could be misplaced, discarded, or carried by someone else. However, finding documents connected to the same individual in proximity to multiple burial sites immediately attracted investigators' attention. The receipts suggested that Corona had some connection to locations where victims had been buried, raising questions that demanded further examination. Additional documents strengthened those suspicions. Investigators also located bank deposit slips containing Corona's name and address. Like the receipts, these items were not direct evidence of homicide by themselves. Yet their presence near graves where murdered victims had been concealed was difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. Detectives began comparing every document recovered during the excavation, looking for recurring names, locations, and connections. Gradually, one individual appeared repeatedly throughout the growing collection of evidence. That individual was Juan Corona. While forensic teams processed physical evidence recovered from the orchards, Other investigators concentrated on reconstructing the victim's final movements. This effort required interviewing farmers, laborers, boarding house operators, and anyone who might have encountered the victims shortly before they disappeared. The transient nature of the victims' lives complicated this process. Many had moved frequently from one job to another, leaving behind only limited records of their travels. Nevertheless, detectives slowly established timelines for numerous victims, identifying where they had last been seen and with whom they had interacted. Those interviews revealed another recurring pattern. Multiple witnesses recalled seeing victims riding in one Corona's pickup truck before they vanished. Under ordinary circumstances, these observations would have attracted little attention. Corona worked as a labor contractor, and transporting seasonal workers formed part of his legitimate responsibilities. Throughout Northern California, labor contractors routinely drove workers between orchards, labor camps, and farms needing additional help. A man entering Corona's truck did not appear unusual because it reflected the normal operation of agricultural employment. Only after the discovery of 25 graves did those ordinary encounters assume extraordinary significance. Investigators carefully compared witness statements from different locations and different periods. Although many witnesses had never met one another, their descriptions shared notable similarities. Several remembered seeing victims accepting transportation from Corona shortly before those individuals were never seen again. Detectives recognized that no single witness had observed a murder. There were no eyewitnesses describing the attacks themselves. Instead, investigators assembled a chain of circumstantial evidence, connecting the victim's last confirmed movements to the same individual. As interviews expanded beyond seasonal workers, investigators also spoke with orchard owners and farmers throughout the region. These interviews provided additional context regarding Corona's daily activities. Farmers confirmed that he regularly recruited laborers and transported workers between different agricultural properties. His occupation gave him routine access to the same population from which nearly all the victims had come. Rather than weakening suspicions, this information reinforced investigators' developing theory. Corona possessed both the opportunity to encounter vulnerable workers and legitimate reasons for traveling throughout the orchards where bodies had been discovered. Detectives also compared Corona's known movements with the approximate periods during which victims disappeared. According to the investigation, these timelines corresponded closely enough to strengthen the growing case against him. Again, no single piece of information conclusively established guilt. However, investigators increasingly viewed the evidence collectively rather than individually. Documents connected Corona to burial sites. Witnesses placed victims in his truck before they vanished. Farmers confirmed his regular movement throughout the agricultural areas where graves were found. The combined weight of these facts persuaded investigators that further action had become necessary. Based on the accumulating evidence, authorities obtained a search warrant for Corona's residence in Yuba City. The decision represented a significant step in the investigation. A search of a suspect's home required legal authorization supported by sufficient evidence, and detectives believed they had reached that threshold. During the early morning hours of May 26, 1971, law enforcement officers executed the warrant and searched Corona's residence. The search produced several items that investigators considered highly significant. Among the evidence recovered were 2 knives bearing bloodstains. Officers also seized a machete, a weapon consistent with the type of injuries documented during forensic examinations of many victims. In addition, investigators recovered a handgun, bloodstained clothing, and a notebook containing the names of numerous agricultural workers. According to the case materials, some of those listed in the notebook were among the identified victims. Investigators also found documents connected to victims, further reinforcing the growing network of associations already emerging from evidence recovered near the graves. It is important to understand the investigative context of 1971. Modern DNA analysis did not yet exist. Detectives could not rely upon genetic testing to establish precise biological links between evidence and specific individuals. Instead, homicide investigations depended upon physical evidence, witness testimony, documentary records, forensic pathology, and the careful reconstruction of events. Prosecutors therefore built their case, not around one decisive scientific breakthrough, but around the cumulative strength of numerous interconnected facts. Every receipt recovered near a grave, every witness recalling a victim entering Corona's truck, every farmer confirming Corona's movements, every bloodstained item recovered from his home, and every name recorded inside his notebook became pieces of a much larger evidentiary puzzle. Individually, each fact might have invited alternative explanations. Collectively, investigators believed they pointed toward a single conclusion. As detectives reviewed the evidence gathered during the search, they also considered the remarkable consistency between the victims themselves. Nearly all belonged to the same vulnerable population. They were middle-aged men searching for temporary agricultural employment. Many traveled alone. Many had recently been paid. Many lacked family members who would immediately report their disappearance. Investigators concluded that these similarities were unlikely to be accidental. Instead, they suggested deliberate victim selection by someone familiar with the agricultural labor system. Corona's profession fit that profile precisely. His work brought him into regular contact with hundreds of seasonal workers, allowing him to identify individuals who appeared isolated and vulnerable. According to prosecutors, this occupational access explained how the alleged offender could repeatedly approach victims without creating immediate suspicion. During the investigation, authorities also revisited the broader timeline established from witness interviews and victim identifications. The murders were believed to have occurred between February and May of 1971. Within that relatively brief period, investigators alleged that 25 men had disappeared after encounters linked in various ways to Corona. The consistency of this timeline strengthened prosecutors' argument that the crimes represented an ongoing pattern rather than unrelated acts of violence committed by different offenders. By the conclusion of the investigative phase, detectives believed they had assembled a compelling body of circumstantial evidence. They had no recorded confession. They had no eyewitness who observed the killings themselves. They had no DNA technology capable of providing definitive biological identification. Yet they possessed something prosecutors regarded as equally powerful: a coherent chain of physical evidence, documentary records, witness testimony, occupational opportunity, and recovered items that consistently pointed toward the same suspect. On May 26, 1971, following the execution of the search warrant and the seizure of evidence from his residence, Juan Corona was arrested. The investigation that had begun with one suspicious patch of disturbed soil had now produced a suspect accused of carrying out one of the deadliest serial murder cases in American history. The focus would soon shift from orchards and excavation sites to the courtroom, where prosecutors would present the evidence gathered during months of investigation. While the defense would challenge both the strength of that evidence and the significance of Corona's documented history of mental illness, the next chapter would determine whether the extensive investigation had uncovered enough proof to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. By the morning of May 26, 1971, the investigation had reached a decisive turning point. During the previous weeks, what had started as the discovery of a single body beneath a peach orchard had grown into one of the largest homicide investigations California had ever undertaken. 25 victims had been recovered from shallow graves scattered throughout orchards and agricultural land in Sutter County. Investigators had spent countless hours documenting burial sites, interviewing witnesses, examining physical evidence, and tracing the final known movements of the victims. As those separate lines of inquiry gradually converged, one name continued to appear with remarkable consistency: Juan Corona, a labor contractor who worked throughout the orchards surrounding Yuba City, had become the central focus of the investigation. Acting under a lawfully issued search warrant, officers entered Corona's residence during the early morning hours. The search resulted in the seizure of several items that investigators believed were highly significant to the case. According to the evidence collected during the investigation, officers recovered 2 blood-stained knives, a machete, a handgun, blood-stained clothing, and a notebook containing the names of agricultural workers, including individuals later identified among the victims. Investigators also recovered documents connected to victims, adding to the documentary evidence that had already been found near several burial sites. Taken together with witness testimony and materials recovered from the orchards, detectives believed they had assembled sufficient evidence to proceed. Juan Corona was arrested later that same day. His arrest marked the end of the initial investigation, but only the beginning of what would become a lengthy legal process. News of the arrest spread rapidly throughout California and across the United States. The discovery of 25 victims had already generated extraordinary public attention, and the identification of a suspect intensified that interest even further. Newspapers closely followed every development. The public struggled to comprehend how so many men could allegedly have been murdered within a relatively short period while working in what had appeared to be an ordinary agricultural community. For the families of identified victims, the arrest offered the possibility that the deaths of their relatives might finally receive legal accountability. For investigators, however, an arrest alone was not enough. Everything they had uncovered during months of investigation would now face close scrutiny inside a courtroom. The prosecution carried the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Corona was responsible for all 25 murders. That responsibility required presenting evidence carefully and systematically. The first trial began in 1972 and immediately attracted widespread media attention. The sheer scale of the case distinguished it from most homicide prosecutions. Rather than addressing a single victim, prosecutors presented evidence involving 25 separate murders connected through a common investigative theory. Every element of the investigation became important. Prosecutors relied upon the cumulative strength of physical evidence, witness testimony, and documentary records rather than any single dramatic piece of proof. Their case rested on several principal arguments. Witnesses had described seeing numerous victims entering Corona's pickup truck before they disappeared. Farmers confirmed that Corona regularly transported agricultural workers throughout the same region, where bodies were later discovered. Documents bearing Corona's name, including receipts and bank deposit slips, had been recovered near several burial sites. The search of his residence produced blood-stained knives, a machete, blood-stained clothing, a handgun, and notebooks containing the names of agricultural workers, including some of the victims. Prosecutors argued that when these facts were considered together, they established a consistent pattern linking Corona to both the victims and the locations where their bodies had been buried. The prosecution also emphasized Corona's unique occupational position. As a labor contractor, he possessed legitimate access to seasonal workers seeking employment. He regularly recruited laborers, transported them between orchards, and knew which individuals were new to the area, traveling alone, or recently paid. Prosecutors argued that this access explained how victims could disappear after voluntarily accepting transportation or offers of work without immediately arousing suspicion. Their theory did not depend on proving elaborate deception. Instead, they suggested that Corona simply exploited relationships that already existed within the normal operation of California's agricultural labor system. The defense approached the case from a different direction. Rather than attempting to deny Corona's previous employment as a labor contractor or dispute his contact with seasonal workers, defense attorneys concentrated heavily on his documented psychiatric history. They reminded the court that Corona had been hospitalized in 1956 after experiencing paranoia, hearing voices, prolonged insomnia, and unusual behavior. During that earlier hospitalization, he had received treatment with antipsychotic medication before eventually being released. The defense argued that these documented mental health problems demonstrated the existence of significant psychiatric illness. They maintained that his mental condition should play a central role in evaluating both his conduct and his criminal responsibility. The prosecution did not dispute that Corona had previously received psychiatric treatment. Instead, prosecutors argued that his earlier hospitalization did not prevent him from understanding the nature of his actions or from being held legally responsible for them. According to the prosecution's position, the available evidence demonstrated planning, repeated conduct over several months, and deliberate concealment of victims through burial in shallow graves. They argued that these actions were consistent with someone capable of recognizing and attempting to hide criminal behavior. The issue of mental illness became one of the most closely examined aspects of the trial. Yet despite extensive discussion, the court ultimately did not conclude that Corona lacked criminal responsibility because of his psychiatric history. Another important feature of the trial involved the absence of certain forms of evidence familiar to modern audiences. Today, DNA analysis often plays a central role in homicide prosecutions. In 1972, however, such technology did not exist. The jury instead evaluated physical evidence, documentary records, forensic findings, witness testimony, and the overall pattern established during the investigation. Prosecutors therefore relied upon the combined strength of numerous interconnected facts rather than a single scientific breakthrough. The jury was asked to consider not isolated pieces of evidence, but the cumulative picture they created when viewed together. After hearing the evidence presented by both sides, the jury reached its decision. In January 1973, Juan Corona was convicted on 25 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict represented one of the most significant criminal convictions in California history. The court imposed 25 life sentences, reflecting the 25 victims identified during the investigation. For many observers, the verdict appeared to bring a measure of legal closure to a case that had shocked the nation. Yet the legal proceedings did not end there. Several years later, the case returned to court because of procedural issues unrelated to the factual allegations themselves. In 1978, Corona's original conviction was overturned due to procedural error, requiring a completely new trial. This development did not declare him innocent, nor did it reject the evidence presented during the first proceedings. Instead, it reflected the legal principle that criminal convictions must be obtained through procedures consistent with the requirements of a fair trial. As a result, prosecutors were required to present their case once again before another jury. The retrial began with many of the same fundamental questions that had shaped the original proceedings. Prosecutors again presented evidence linking Corona to the victims through witness testimony, documentary evidence recovered near burial sites, materials seized from his residence, and his role as a labor contractor with direct access to vulnerable seasonal workers. The defense again raised issues concerning his documented psychiatric history and challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. Although years had passed since the murders and the original trial, the essential facts presented by both sides remained largely consistent with those argued previously. After considering the evidence presented during the retrial, the second jury reached the same conclusion as the first. In 1982, Juan Corona was once again convicted of all 25 murders. The court again imposed life imprisonment, reaffirming the earlier judgment despite the procedural reversal that had required a second trial. The second conviction effectively concluded the principal legal disputes regarding criminal responsibility for the murders. Although debate over motive and mental illness continued among observers and researchers, the judicial process had twice determined that the evidence established Corona's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Even after 2 trials, however, important questions remained unanswered. The courtroom established legal responsibility, but it did not fully explain why the crimes had occurred. Throughout both proceedings, no universally accepted motive emerged. Various theories, including explosive violence, a possible sexual motive, hostility toward homosexual men, and the influence of mental illness, continued to be discussed. Yet none achieved definitive agreement. The absence of a clear explanation distinguished the Juan Corona case from many other notorious criminal investigations. The courts determined who was legally responsible, but the deeper question of why 25 vulnerable men lost their lives remained unresolved. For the families of the victims, however, the verdicts carried a different meaning. While no legal judgment could reverse the tragedy or restore those who had been killed, the convictions acknowledged the value of lives that had too often gone unnoticed while the victims were still alive. Men who had traveled to California seeking temporary work, many without permanent homes or close family nearby, were no longer anonymous disappearances within the agricultural labor system. Their deaths had been investigated, their identities pursued, and their cases presented before two separate juries. The legal process could not answer every question, but it ensured that the victims would not simply vanish from history as silently as they had disappeared from the orchards of Sutter County. After Juan Corona was convicted for the second time in 1982, the courtroom chapter of the case came to an end. The legal system had reached the same conclusion twice. Corona was responsible for the murders of 25 men whose bodies had been discovered beneath the orchards of Sutter County. The convictions brought an official resolution to the question of criminal responsibility, but they did not erase the many unanswered questions that had remained since the investigation began. The evidence had established what authorities believed happened. It had established where the victims were found, how they died, and who was held accountable. Yet some questions remained beyond the reach of the courtroom. Why did the killings occur? What motivated the selection of these particular victims? And were all the victims ever discovered? These uncertainties followed the case long after the trials ended. After receiving 25 life sentences, Juan Corona entered the California prison system, where he would spend the remaining decades of his life. For a man whose name had become associated with one of the largest serial murder cases in American history, imprisonment represented a complete transformation of his existence. The individual who had once moved freely through agricultural communities as a labor contractor was now confined within a correctional institution. His daily life was no longer defined by orchards, seasonal workers, and rural roads, but by the restrictions and routines of incarceration. In 1973, shortly after his first conviction, Corona experienced a violent incident inside prison. Another inmate attacked him, leaving Corona seriously injured. As a result of the assault, he lost vision in his left eye. The attack became another significant event in a life already marked by violence and controversy. While the circumstances of prison life placed Corona among other convicted criminals, the severity of his own crimes made him a particularly notorious figure within the correctional system. Over the following years, Corona repeatedly sought release through parole requests. However, those attempts were unsuccessful. Authorities continued to view the nature and scale of his crimes as reasons that he should remain imprisoned. The fact that 25 victims had been identified, combined with the brutality of the murders and the lack of a clear explanation for the crimes, contributed to continued opposition to his release. Although Corona maintained his position within the legal process, the courts and parole authorities did not accept arguments that would have allowed him to leave prison. One of the most persistent questions surrounding the case involved the possibility of additional victims. Investigators had confirmed 25 murders, and those 25 convictions became the official number associated with Corona. However, because the victims were primarily seasonal laborers, homeless individuals, or men without strong social connections, some investigators and observers wondered whether additional unidentified victims might exist. The circumstances that had made these men vulnerable during life also created challenges in determining whether others had disappeared without being reported. Many seasonal workers moved frequently. Some had limited contact with relatives. Some lacked permanent records connecting them to specific communities. As a result, authorities could never completely dismiss the possibility that additional crimes might have occurred. However, no additional victims were officially confirmed beyond the 25 identified in the investigation. The uncertainty surrounding possible additional victims became one of the unresolved aspects of the case. Another enduring issue was the question of motive. In many famous criminal cases, investigators eventually uncover a clear explanation for why an offender acted. Sometimes there are personal conflicts, financial motives, or statements made by the offender that reveal their reasoning. The Juan Corona case was different. Despite extensive investigation and 2 trials, no single motive was established as the definitive explanation. Several theories emerged over time. Some suggested that the murders were connected to uncontrollable violence or psychological instability. Others examined possible sexual motivations or theories involving hostility toward homosexual men. Mental illness was also discussed because of Corona's earlier psychiatric history. However, none of these explanations achieved universal agreement among experts, investigators, or observers of the case. The absence of a clear motive created a lasting sense of uncertainty. The courts had answered the legal question of guilt, but they had not provided a complete psychological explanation for the crimes. The issue of Corona's mental health remained particularly controversial. His psychiatric treatment in 1956 had been documented, and the defense had used that history during both trials to challenge the interpretation of his actions. The fact that he had previously experienced paranoia, hearing voices, insomnia, and unusual behavior raised questions about his psychological condition. However, the legal system determined that this history did not prevent him from being held responsible for the murders. The distinction between mental illness and legal responsibility became a central issue in the case. A person may experience psychiatric problems, but the law requires a specific determination regarding whether those conditions prevent someone from understanding the nature of their actions or distinguishing right from wrong. In Corona's case, the courts determined that he remained responsible for the crimes. Yet outside the courtroom, debate continued. Some continued to examine his psychiatric history as a possible factor in understanding his behavior, while others focused on the evidence of planning and concealment presented during the trials. The victims themselves remained at the center of the case's historical significance. For many years, discussions of the Juan Corona murders focused heavily on the number 25 and the identity of the person convicted. However, behind that number were individual lives. These were men who had traveled to Northern California seeking employment, hoping to earn money through difficult physical labor. They were fathers, relatives, friends, and members of communities that extended beyond the orchards where they worked. Many had lived on the margins of society, not because their lives lacked importance, but because economic hardship and temporary employment made them less visible. Their disappearances were not immediately recognized because their lifestyles involved constant movement. The tragedy of the case highlighted a broader social reality. Vulnerable populations can become especially difficult to protect when systems designed to track missing persons do not fully account for their circumstances. The investigation changed how many people viewed the disappearances of seasonal workers. Before the case, the absence of a laborer might easily be interpreted as another ordinary movement within a mobile workforce. After 25 bodies were discovered, authorities and communities became more aware of the need to take missing persons reports involving transient workers seriously. The case demonstrated that a person's lack of permanent housing, stable employment, or strong social connections should never determine the importance placed on their disappearance. The victims of the Juan Corona murders also became a reminder that crimes against marginalized individuals can remain hidden longer than crimes involving people with greater public visibility. The discovery of their graves forced the public to confront a difficult reality. These men had contributed to California's agricultural economy, yet many of their disappearances had gone unnoticed. Their stories revealed the human cost of a system where thousands of workers moved through communities without leaving lasting records. Years after the convictions, The Juan Corona case remained one of the most significant serial murder investigations in California history. It was remembered not only because of the number of victims, but because of the unusual circumstances surrounding the crimes. The bodies were found in agricultural fields where ordinary workers continued their daily routines. The victims belonged to a population that was often overlooked. The investigation required authorities to search through landscapes that had appeared peaceful while concealing evidence of extraordinary violence. Juan Corona remained in prison for the rest of his life. He continued to request parole, but those efforts were denied. On March 4, 2019, at the age of 85, Corona died of natural causes while still serving his sentence within the California prison system. His death ended the life of a man whose name had become permanently connected with one of America's most disturbing murder cases. However, his death did not erase the questions surrounding the crimes or diminish the importance of remembering the victims. The conclusion of Corona's life marked the end of one chapter. But the story of those 25 men remained. Their identities, their struggles, and the circumstances that made them vulnerable became the lasting lessons of the case. The Juan Corona murders were not only a story about a convicted killer. They were also a story about people whose lives were nearly forgotten, about communities forced to confront hidden violence, and about the responsibility to recognize the humanity of those who exist far from public attention. The Juan Corona murders remain one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of California. Criminal investigations. Decades after the discovery of the first grave in a Sutter County orchard, the case continues to attract attention not only because of the number of victims, but because of the circumstances that allowed the crimes to remain hidden for so long. The story is remembered as a case involving extraordinary violence, but it is equally a story about vulnerability, invisibility, and the lives of people who existed on the edges of society. The 25 men whose bodies were recovered from the orchards were not simply names connected to a criminal investigation. They were individuals who had traveled through Northern California searching for work, stability, and a better future. Their deaths revealed how easily people without permanent homes, strong social connections, or public visibility could disappear without immediate recognition. When the investigation began in May 1971, authorities were confronted with a situation unlike anything they had previously experienced. A single suspicious area of disturbed soil led to the discovery of a hidden grave. That grave revealed a homicide. Additional searches revealed more graves. Investigators were no longer examining one murder scene, but a wide network of burial sites spread across agricultural land. The orchards of Sutter County, places associated with farming and seasonal work, had become the center of one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history at that time. The scale of the investigation demonstrated the enormous challenges faced by law enforcement. Finding 25 victims required extensive coordination, including excavation teams, investigators, forensic specialists, search dogs, and aerial surveillance efforts using infrared cameras. Each recovered body represented another investigative responsibility. Authorities needed to identify the victim, determine the circumstances of death, document evidence, and search for additional information that could explain how the person disappeared. The process was not simply about counting victims. It was about restoring identities to people whose lives had largely been defined by movement and temporary employment. One of the most significant aspects of the case was the background of the victims. Most were seasonal agricultural workers, men who moved between locations depending on where employment was available. They worked in orchards, followed harvest seasons, and often lived without permanent addresses. Some had limited contact with family members. Others were individuals who had already experienced difficult circumstances, including homelessness or unstable employment. These conditions created a population that was particularly difficult to monitor through traditional missing person systems. The case forced communities and authorities to confront an uncomfortable reality. A person's social visibility often affects how quickly their disappearance is noticed. The disappearance of someone with a stable home, a large family network, and a predictable daily routine is more likely to immediately trigger concern. Seasonal laborers often lived very different lives. Their movement was expected. Their absence could be explained away as another job opportunity in another location. A missing worker might not immediately be recognized as a missing person at all. This aspect of the case became one of its most important lasting lessons. The victims were not less important because their lives were less documented. Their circumstances simply made it easier for their disappearances to remain unnoticed. The investigation highlighted the need for greater attention toward vulnerable populations and demonstrated that every missing person deserves serious consideration, regardless of their economic situation or social status. The case also changed public perceptions of agricultural communities. Before the murders were discovered, the orchards surrounding Yuba City and Sutter County represented ordinary rural life. They were places where workers harvested fruit, farmers managed crops, and seasonal employment continued year after year. After the discovery of the graves, those same landscapes became associated with one of California's most notorious criminal investigations. The contrast between the peaceful appearance of the orchards and the violence hidden beneath them contributed to the lasting impact of the case. Another reason the Juan Corona murders remain significant is the unusual relationship between the alleged offender and the victims. Corona was not an unknown stranger appearing from outside the community. He was someone who operated within the same agricultural system as the victims. His role as a labor contractor gave him regular contact with workers searching for employment. This connection became central to the prosecution's argument because it explained how he could approach vulnerable individuals without immediately creating suspicion. The case demonstrated how ordinary positions of trust and responsibility can become central in criminal investigations when evidence reveals abuse of access. Corona's occupation itself was not suspicious. Thousands of workers relied on labor contractors throughout California. Transporting workers and helping them find employment were normal activities. The significance came from how investigators connected those ordinary activities with the disappearances and deaths of multiple victims. The investigation also became an example of how criminal cases can be built through the combination of many separate pieces of evidence. There was no single piece of evidence that answered every question. There was no direct eyewitness account of the murders. There was no modern DNA evidence because such technology did not exist at the time. Instead, investigators relied on the totality of the evidence, witness statements, documents connected to Corona, materials recovered near burial sites, evidence collected from his residence, and the pattern linking victims to the suspect. This method of investigation remains an important part of criminal justice. Many complex cases are not solved by one dramatic discovery, but through patient reconstruction. Investigators must examine relationships, timelines, physical evidence, and human behavior. In the Juan Corona case, the investigation succeeded because separate pieces of information eventually formed a consistent picture. Despite the convictions, the case never produced complete answers. The motive behind the murders remained uncertain. Several theories were discussed, but none became a universally accepted explanation. This absence of a clear motive continues to distinguish the case from many other notorious crimes. The evidence established responsibility, but it did not provide a complete understanding of the mind behind the killings. The possibility of additional victims also remained a source of uncertainty. 25 victims were officially confirmed, and those murders formed the basis of Corona's convictions. However, because many victims came from a population where disappearances were difficult to track, questions remained about whether every victim had been found. No additional victims were officially confirmed, but the possibility contributed to the continuing mystery surrounding the case. The legal proceedings themselves also became an important part of the case's history. Corona's first conviction in 1973 represented a major legal victory for prosecutors and investigators. However, procedural errors resulted in the conviction being overturned in 1978, requiring a second trial. The retrial in 1982 resulted in another conviction for all 25 murders. The repeated legal process demonstrated the importance of ensuring that even the most serious criminal cases follow proper procedures. For the families of the victims, the convictions provided recognition that their loved ones had not been forgotten. The legal system could not undo the suffering caused by the murders, but it could officially acknowledge the crimes and hold the responsible individual accountable. The victims, many of whom had received little attention during their disappearances, became permanently remembered as part of one of the most significant investigations in American criminal history. Juan Corona died on March 4, 2019, at the age of 85 while still serving his sentence in the California prison system. His death closed the final chapter of his personal story, but it did not end discussion of the case. The questions surrounding the murders, the challenges faced by investigators, and the lives of the victims continue to make the case significant. Ultimately, the legacy of the Juan Corona murders is not only about the crimes committed or the person convicted. It is about understanding the conditions that allowed vulnerable people to disappear unnoticed. It is about recognizing the humanity of individuals whose lives were often overlooked. It is about remembering that behind every investigation statistic are real people with families, histories, and hopes. The orchards of Sutter County eventually returned to their normal agricultural rhythms. Trees continued to grow. Workers continued to harvest crops. The landscape moved forward. But beneath the history of those fields remains a reminder of 25 lives lost and a warning about the importance of seeing those who are most easily overlooked. The Juan Corona case endures because it represents not only a criminal investigation, but also a deeper reflection on justice, memory, and the responsibility to protect every member of society. The Juan Corona murders remain one of the most significant and haunting criminal cases in California history. More than 5 decades have passed since investigators entered the orchards of Sutter County and uncovered the first evidence of a tragedy that would eventually reveal 25 victims. Time has changed many things. The communities surrounding Yuba City have continued to grow. Agricultural work has continued through new seasons and new generations of workers. The legal battles surrounding the case have long ended. The man convicted of the murders is no longer alive. Yet the memory of what happened in those orchards has not disappeared. The reason the case continues to be remembered is not only because of the number of victims or the identity of the person convicted. It remains significant because of the human stories behind the investigation. The 25 men whose bodies were recovered were people whose lives followed paths that were common among seasonal agricultural workers in Northern California during the early 1970s. They traveled in search of employment. They accepted difficult jobs. They moved when the harvest changed. They lived with uncertainty because temporary work often meant temporary stability. Many of these men existed within a world where disappearing could happen without immediate attention. Their circumstances were shaped by economic hardship, migration, and isolation. They were not necessarily surrounded by large networks of family and friends who would immediately recognize their absence. A worker who failed to appear one morning might have simply moved on to another opportunity. A person who stopped returning to a familiar location might have been assumed to have found work elsewhere. These assumptions reflected the reality of seasonal labor, but they also created conditions where victims could remain missing for extended periods. The discovery of the graves forced society to confront that reality. The investigation revealed that vulnerability is not only about physical danger. It can also come from being unseen. The victims were easier to overlook because their lives were not always documented in the same way as those with permanent homes and stable communities. Their disappearances did not immediately create widespread alarm. Their absence blended into the movement of a workforce that was constantly changing. The tragedy of the Juan Corona case was therefore not only the violence committed against these men. It was also the realization that so many people could vanish without the world immediately. Recognizing what had happened, the investigation became a reminder that every missing person represents a life with value, regardless of occupation, financial situation, or social position. The case also demonstrated the importance of persistence in criminal investigations. When the first body was discovered in May 1971, investigators did not yet understand the full scale of what they were facing. They began with a single grave. Through careful examination and continued searching, they uncovered a much larger pattern. Each discovery created new questions. Each interview provided another piece of information. Each piece of evidence helped investigators reconstruct events that had taken place months earlier. The work required patience and determination. There was no simple answer waiting to be found. There was no single witness who could explain everything. There was no modern scientific technology capable of immediately connecting every piece of evidence. Instead, investigators relied on traditional methods, examining physical evidence, speaking with witnesses, studying documents, and building a timeline of events. The eventual case against Juan Corona was constructed through this process. Prosecutors argued that the evidence demonstrated a clear connection between Corona, the victims, and the burial sites. Witnesses described seeing victims with Corona before they disappeared. Documents connected to Corona were found near graves. Evidence recovered from his home became part of the prosecution's argument. The courts ultimately accepted that the combined evidence established his responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. However, even after 2 convictions, the case retained unanswered questions. One of the most enduring mysteries involved motive. The legal system determined who was responsible, but it did not provide a complete explanation of why the murders occurred. Several possibilities were discussed over the years, including psychological factors and different theories about possible motives. Yet no single explanation was accepted by all observers. This uncertainty is one reason the case continues to attract attention. Human beings naturally search for explanations, especially in cases involving extreme violence. Understanding who committed a crime may answer the question of responsibility, but understanding why it happened often proves far more difficult. In the Juan Corona case, the evidence established the actions attributed to him, but the deeper reasons behind those actions remained unclear. The case also raised questions about whether all victims were discovered. 25 men were officially confirmed as victims, and those deaths formed the basis of Corona's convictions. However, because many victims belonged to a population that was difficult to track, the possibility of additional unidentified victims remained a subject of discussion. No further victims were officially confirmed, but the uncertainty reflected one of the most painful aspects of the investigation: the possibility that some stories may never have been fully recovered. Despite these unanswered questions, the most important legacy of the case belongs to the victims themselves. It is easy for discussions of notorious crimes to become focused on the offender. Names, photographs, investigations, and trials often center around the person accused or convicted. But the true human cost of a crime is measured through the lives that were taken. The men found in the orchards were not merely part of a criminal statistic. They had personal histories. They had experiences before they arrived in California. They had relationships, memories, and hopes. They worked difficult jobs because they were trying to survive and improve their circumstances. Their lives were more than the circumstances of their deaths. Remembering the victims means recognizing that their stories did not begin with the murders. They were individuals before they became part of an investigation. Their identities mattered before investigators wrote reports about them. Their lives had meaning before their names appeared in court documents. The Juan Corona case also remains a reminder of the responsibility of communities and institutions to protect vulnerable populations, seasonal workers, migrants, and individuals living without stable circumstances are often among those most difficult to reach when something goes wrong. The case demonstrated the importance of taking every disappearance seriously, regardless of whether a person has a permanent address or a large support network. Justice in the Juan Corona case took many years. The first conviction came in 1973. That conviction was later overturned because of procedural issues, leading to another trial and another conviction in 1982. The repeated legal process reflected the importance of ensuring fairness within the justice system, even in cases involving the most serious crimes. Corona spent the remainder of his life in prison. His requests for parole were denied, and he remained incarcerated until his death from natural causes on March 4, 2019, at the age of 85. His death ended the life of the person legally responsible for one of America's most notorious serial murder cases, but it did not end the importance of remembering what happened. The orchards where the victims were discovered eventually returned to their ordinary purpose. Seasons changed. Crops continued to grow. Workers continued their routines. The physical landscape moved forward, but the history attached to those locations remains. The Juan Corona murders are remembered because they represent more than a series of crimes. They represent the danger faced by people whose lives are overlooked. They represent the importance of listening to the stories of those who are often ignored. They represent the dedication required from investigators searching for answers when those answers are hidden beneath years of uncertainty. Above all, the case remains a reminder that behind every investigation file are human beings. Behind every number is a person. Behind every victim is a story that deserves to be remembered. The 25 men whose lives ended in the orchards of Sutter County were not defined by how they died. They should be remembered for the fact that they lived, they worked, they traveled, they searched for opportunities. They had hopes and experiences that existed long before they became victims. The final lesson of the Juan Corona case is not simply about crime. It is about visibility, compassion, and the responsibility to recognize the humanity of every person, especially those who are easiest to overlook. The investigation ended. The trials ended. The convicted offender died. But the memory of the victims remains, and that memory is the most important part of the story.